Does history have technicians? Is the technician responsible for the utterance of historical truth? Is time travel possible without the technician's assistance? Searching for the opera cinema in the marketplace in Accra, I found it has become a lighting warehouse. From inside the Museum of Technology, I photographed the Ministry of Information, which is housed in the film archives, which houses the film archives of both the colonial and the post-independence films of Ghana and the British Gold Coast Film Unit. Fallen into ruin, I was told that officials no longer allowed access to researchers. The vinegar syndrome is a process that begins from the moment the film is printed on all forms of celluloid. Depending on storage conditions, the kind of condition can be slowed down but never really stopped. In Nigeria, a friend told me that on entering the archives, in a kind of lost archive that was recently recovered by a group of filmmakers in Nigeria, she had to drink milk before she entered the archive as a kind of a ritual to prevent the vinegar syndrome. In the story of time travel, I am the technician, an assistant technician to the research for the case 8, file 4 of Jack X versus the Academy of Unthought Historical Promises, presented to the Interplanetary Commission for Human, Non-Human, and Technological Justice in the year 2219. I never met the time traveler. We communicated only by a series of coded transmissions and transactions that operated through folds in space-time. My job was to attempt to reconstitute the lost films of history hidden in the soil, a ghostly inscription. During the South African War from 1899 to 1901, a batch of film reels was intercepted by a Boer General, removing them from their casings and leaving them strewn across the veld to burn in the sun. I begin from this image of nitrocellulose film stock turning to smoke, then fine ashen dust, and ultimately soil. The composition of nitrocellulose film stock is a variation of an original process used to make the low-order explosive gun cotton. It is highly flammable, a common cause for many devastating fires in cinemas and archives. I was faced with the problem of excavating the fine nitrate ash from the soil and reconstituting it into the moving image, or to treat film at the level of the granular, the molecular, the crystalline, the atomic, a kind of process of reverse entropy. The time traveler's case was built on a simple premise. They wanted to charge the Academy of Unthought Historical Promises with the failure to recognize the possibility of history beyond property. The plaintiff in the case is the soil of the planet Earth itself. Of course, they faced the problem of constituting the soil first as a body and then as a political subject. The modern theory of soil begins with the idea that soil is not a residue of a process, but rather a process in itself, and in which a system of layers critical to life on Earth grows out of fine rock particles. The Russian geologist Vasily Dubachev is given credit for producing the earliest comprehensive description of these layers, which he termed the soil body. For soil, for Dubachev, is a process, a thing composed of many parts, and its consistency as a body comes from the capacity to be recognized as a system of resemblances that repeat, and whose repetition is produced by the soil's specific duration in time and space. In the 1959 novel The Palm Wine Drinkard, Amos Tutuola, a Nigerian writer, writes about a supernatural character who cannot live without consuming large amounts of palm wine. When his palm wine tapster unexpectedly dies, he goes on a journey in search of the dead man. His journey takes him into the spaces beyond the living. For a time, the palm wine drinkard lives amongst a people turned red by the color of the soil, the red dust people. Brian Aldiss's dystopian science fiction Earthworks from 1965. In the novel, the premise is that there is no more room in the ground for the dead. And the novel opens, the dead man drifted along in the breeze. A few ripe flies remained with him, although he was far from land, traveling light above the complacent South Atlantic. He was coming out of Africa, moving steadily for me. This is the novel that Robert Smithson reads on the bus on his journey to Passaic to write the text, The Monuments of Passaic, or to produce the artwork, which he publishes in Art Forum, entitled The Monuments of Passaic. At the end of the text, he writes this: I should now like to prove the irreversibility of eternity by using a jejune experiment for proving entropy. Picture in your mind's eye the sandbox divided in half with black sand on one side and white sand on the other. We take a child and have him run hundreds of times clockwise in the box until the sand gets mixed and begins to turn gray. After that, we have him run anti-clockwise, but the result will not be the restoration of the original division, but a greater degree of grayness and an increase of entropy. Of course, if we filmed such an experiment, we could prove the relationship of eternity by showing the film backwards. We could prove the reversibility of eternity. But then, sooner or later, the film itself would crumble or get lost and enter the state of irreversibility. Somehow this suggests that the cinema offers an elusive or a temporary escape from physical dissolution. The false immortality of the film gives the viewer an illusion of control over eternity, but the superstars are fading. The sandbox was the last monument in the journey to Passaic. How do we learn to live with the dead, to make space for their silences and the presence of their weight? I was not the woman reading the letter in Chris Marker's Sans Soleil. I was not a figure in a serialized fiction like Conrad's Marlowe, nor did I have the right to give voice to the voiceless image of the one who looks directly into the camera. I was more like the manipulator of images on the EMS video synthesizer in Sans Soleil. I was merely trying to bring something to light. Women are largely absent in the archives. Sana Nahada shoots much of the footage of Guinea-Bissau that appears in Sans Soleil. He is more or less erased from history, hidden in the credits. As I began my research for The Time Traveler, images of fire seemed to multiply. It seemed that the closer I came to light, the closer I came to fire. The only way to extract the nitrate from the soil body, it seemed, was to reconstruct the images, it seemed that the only way to extract the nitrate from the soil body, to reconstruct the images that could tell its story, was to begin to understand the atomic nature of film itself. Since 1945, the destruction of the visual order of the atomic light and force has haunted Japanese visual culture. Yet the origins of this post-war crisis, brought about by the advent of a penetrating radiation, had begun 50 years earlier, in about 1895, with the emergence of three new phenomenologies of the inside: psychoanalysis, X-rays, and the cinema. 3 techniques or technologies that pursued the scene of interiority, the opening of the mind, the body, and the world. X-ray radiation was perhaps the emblem, the mysterious ray, a figure for the body of a new form of light that yielded a new visuality, a modern form of light, and its transmission that permeated the 20th century. I thought a lot about my voice, the desire for the image, for the voice, the desire of the image for the voice that makes you trust it, situates it in the statement. Archives, says Foucault, are statements. Whether true or not, they present themselves as trustable. The voice suggests a body. Archives make visible truths. They bring to light. I began to stare into flashing lights in my studio, to draw into the celluloid to attempt to capture the pattern of an afterimage. We are at the end of the age of the filament bulb, the bulb that makes visible its inner fire. While Joseph Conrad was finishing The Heart of Darkness in 1899, the British went to war with the Boer republics of South Africa. The war was one of the first to be captured on film. It was certainly not a war only between British and Boer, white settlers, but involved all South Africans and the thousands of black South Africans, not yet a nation, but many ethnicities and sovereignties in place for thousands of years before, who died on the battlefield and in the concentration camps during protracted sieges, remains largely invisible. Heart of Darkness is published as a series in 3 parts in Blackwood's magazine. In a famous lecture many years later, Chinua Achebe, the really important Nigerian author, calls the novel racist. Was it even a novel? This is the Biograph cinematographic camera operated in the field of the Anglo-Boer War by a technician or a kind of a filmmaker, self-declared filmmaker called W.E.B. Dixon. In his kind of account of the war that he writes as a diary, which is to a certain extent true but somewhat fictionalized in my opinion, Dixon talks of how he positioned the camera alongside the guns, the 12-inch field guns that were dragged on a wagon, adapted from naval guns that they originally were. He speaks of how, in order to still hear the sound of the cannon and know where to point his camera, he had to not block his ears, which one would normally do like this, but drop his jaw at the sound of the cannon fire. Which protects your ears but still allows you to hear the direction in which the cannon fire was going. In a strangely kind of reified set of operations, then the cannon is loaded, the cannon fires, he drops his jaw and rolls the camera. Very few of the films of the war survive. Some are unwatchable, stored in the vaults of the South African National Film Archive, where the Steenbeck viewing tables no longer operate. Are these images of war or patterns of light we can track across spaces and times? Inflections of modernism's desire for abstraction as authorless operation, as process. It seems important to connect 2 moments of atomic violence and forgetting: the burnt films of the South African War, and what Virilio calls the War of Light, both World War I and World War II, which he reads as a single war. Colonial violence is continuous with modern technologies of vision. This is a still from one of the only actual battle scenes captured in one of the films of the Anglo-Boer War, a lost film. It is the unique possibility of moving image forms to unite fragmentary units of spaces and times into a singular spatial temporal field. This is in part an effect of film's ability to move between different spaces and times on the African continent. However, Jack refused to focus on film circulation alone, but rather on a range of archival material that placed colonial movement within a broader field of textualities, which included maps and travel diaries. A three-dimensional picture of space-time is made possible by technologies of inscription and transmission that operate at the level of the grain. In the films, land, sea, air merge as a singular materiality tied to the notion of a field that can be acted on. We invoke the idea of the grain. Sorry, my PowerPoint seems to be ahead of me. Grain and the granular in relation to land, technology, colonial extraction as a poetics to think through filmic inscriptions of whiteness, land, and race on the African continent, which becomes an abstraction, a line traced across a terre vacante. I'm interested in thinking about the state of nature and the state of exception that Giorgio Agamben joins in kind of a diagram that he makes within Homo Sacer. The state of nature and the state of exception are nothing but two sides of a single topological process in which what is presupposed as external, the state of nature, now reappears as in a Mobius strip or Leyden jar, an electricity generating kind of device from the early 1800s and 1700s, in the inside as a state of exception. So sovereign power becomes the impossibility of distinguishing between an outside and an inside, a kind of space, an actual like spatio-temporal thing or space or event or structure in which all rules are accepted, in which the exception becomes possible, in which there is no law and anything becomes possible. And to kind of think about this in relation to the formation of colonial territories as states of exception and states of nature. It is the viewer as much as the producer that inscribes the moving image with meaning and affect. It is us who produce the site of the colonial as a territory of exception. That is why it may be useful to break up the montage, to stutter and interrupt it. The operation of moving images and the mobility of the cinema produced the empire as an imaginary territory to be possessed. In Africa, these multiple modalities of movement are in operation from the late 19th century in the form of maps, war diaries, lantern slides, photographs, heliographic signaling, and telegraph signaling. Those are telegraphic machines being taught to a group of West Africans. A set of image operations and operators accompany the colonial traveler, trader, soldier, cartographer, and official. No operation is neutral. No technology operates without a technician. The camera, the telegraph, and the heliograph share a field of inscription and transmission within the frame. Descriptions and maps in the war diaries of British officers function within a similar set of operations of abstraction. In the film KR Signals, the filmmaker Kingston Davies, this was a film made in the 1930s, so after the Boer War period, produces hand-drawn maps as the introduction to his film, kind of crudely produced as well. The film kind of follows the operations of both heliograph signaling stations and the construction of telegraph signaling stations across a kind of unnamed and unlocated territory between Kenya, Sudan, and Tanzania, in which the operations of the Northern Brigade, or KAR, signaling kind of units happen. These are the construction of telegraph poles in the region. And these are the heliograph signaling stations, kind of a crude mirror system that works with natural light to signal across quite vast territories of space, provided there is visibility and height for the signals to be seen. This is a stereoscope viewer, and these are stereoscopic images made during the South African War. It became common and popular for traveling lecturers, colonial explorers, and geographers to complement the stories of their journeys with photographic glass slides using 100-year-old technology at that point in the 19th century, driven by gaslight, called the magic lantern. Jonathan Crary argues that it is not the lantern slide as much as the stereoscopic photograph that is the origin of cinema. I disagree. I'm interested in the amateur as a figure of colonial visuality and violence, the trickster, the fool, the one who knows, the officer, the kind of childlike figure who animates the operations of this colonial visuality. In the 1930s, a number of British mobile film units began producing propaganda and education films for African audiences, and some for British circulation. After independence, these former colonial cinematic apparatuses would be used for production of mobile screening and circulation of educational films and films with the nation-building and nationalist intention. This is largely in Ghana, where I'm drawing these films from. Many of these films remain in archives decaying due to storage conditions, heat, and underfunding. Why remember? On gold mines in the Witwatersrand, the tailings dams of which still define the geography of contemporary Johannesburg, it was common for the South African education services to show propaganda and education films together with westerns and Charlie Chaplin films. The miners who were shown the films, along with really racist and condescending kind of educational and instructional films, had developed a kind of identification with Chaplin, in a sense, for me, as a figure of whiteness and ridiculousness of the colonial project as well. He was often the kind of underdog in the films, doing some kind of ridiculous form of labor. They had a nickname for him, which translates from the word Sidakwa, which means drunk man or the drunk one. I woke from a dream in which I discovered that my left eye had been glued shut. In the dream, I had only noticed once I confronted myself in the mirror, my own reflection. Blindness reveals itself only in the after image. As the research progresses, Jack became or becomes more and more obsessed with the blinding of the camera, of the projector lamp as fire, the transformation of light into heat, the lost energy of the inefficient filament bulb. What is the cost of appearing as a body before the law, as the film corpus of the soil bearing witness to its division and disembodiment, the reversal of ash to flame, to fire, to light, by the ashen hands of the technician? How to embody the violence of the encounter with violent images, to bury oneself, to avoid becoming the sentimental agent.